Today's discussion on facades and the sort of narrative behind it. I think Smaran and Siddharth both had some fabulous presentations, and it was nice to see that much of what I have to say tied in very well with what they were saying, for instance. So I'm going to start with this sort of quote from Charles Eames, and I think in many ways it is one of my favorite sort of citations, which basically says recognizing the need is the primary condition of any design. And I feel that that holds good for all parts of design, and that holds good for all facets of design, be it in furniture, like Charles was, or for that matter, buildings, homes, and so on. One thing, however, that intrigues me when I sort of travel both inside India and outside, and when I come back to India, mostly inside, is that we see that in many ways we've always been governed by this, sort of proverbial box sort of environment. And for most of us, and I think the challenges that both Smaran and Siddharth mentioned many a time is it's always a very tight site. It's always a developer, for instance, looking for the maximum FSI on that piece of land, or for that matter, the maximum bang for the buck that one could sort of get out of it. If you look the world over now, you see a lot of freeform structures out there, and you see a lot of buildings such as these. That's called the Interlace in Singapore, which are quite fabulously built beyond most expectations. Uh, but when we come back to India, I see and I often wonder why. I think many a time we're faced with two fundamental issues. One is, of course, we have the municipalities in the different states, which have some governing restrictions. And then, of course, we have, let's say, the tenets of Vastu. For us, at least, from where I come from in Hyderabad, this is typically the hotbed of it. And most often than not, these seemingly become or they are used as excuses or roadblocks rather than looked at in terms of a design challenge. And I feel that is something that needs to fundamentally change first. So we did have, of course, talking about how form follows function. And I think in both the previous presentations, you were seeing a lot of what was also said some time back about how form could follow fiction. And in this, I don't mean in a sort of unrealistic sense, but in a very real sense, it's about storytelling and design. If you look back in terms of the structures that have been built over the last century or more, you see many of these structures all have a story behind them. So fiction in the form of storytelling, and where you really get a story out from what you are sort of trying to tell or talk about in terms of design. I think that is for me the key part of design. Of course, this is not just for India, but this is one of my own interpretations of what form should and does follow, and that is finance. I feel in many ways, almost every designer is confronted with the challenge of finance. It's almost at any level that you see these issues, and in order for a successful project to be really successful, for instance, it is about, of course, the client, their own mindsets, the amount of leverage that they allow the consultant, designer, and the mutual faith and the trust that one has, right? And bottom line, also finance. So I'm going to take you to just one a project of ours, and before I get to that, one of the things that I feel are crucially important, there are three elements to our designs that I feel are crucially important. One is, of course, the sort of hybrid narrative. And this is particularly complicated when you're doing large scale projects, many of which you saw up ahead in these presentations. It is about bringing together a set of requirements from different people. For instance, if you're in a gated community, you have different sets of people through this community, whether they are elderly people, some people could be physically challenged, there are others who might have young children, and so on. So everybody approaches this buying decision or this living decision from different with different ideas, and that's what we call narrative hybrids. Spatial organization, of course, and this is where function comes in. I mean, to a great extent, it's about climate studies, it's about seeing how you orient spaces, it's about having the openings, the wall to window ratios, and so on. And last part, I think, in a great way, is about the experience, because at the end of the day, I feel it's a lot about us sort of creating these possibilities for human life. So experiential living for me is crucially important. This one project that I want to take you through, I deliberately had this this smallish house. I should say it's not a small house; it's about 15,000 square feet. But this is a house, the one we called Dancing with Nature. It had a particularly interesting facade, and it came out of a particularly interesting story, and that's what I will tell you today. Um, the idea the client had was to have this home where they had sort of landscape and architecture sort of entwined and in some sort of embrace. And they wanted to have landscape, somewhat set itself off in equal terms with the architecture itself. So I was at a party that night where I did see a couple dancing, and for me, I thought to myself, I said, what if we could sort of cradle the architecture, which you see in blue, with the landscape that you see in green, much like how, let's say, a couple dancing, the walls sorts. So what we did with the floor plans is this is how we brought the floor plans with the architecture and the landscape. So you see the sort of coupling of sorts between both, and this was the first step. So once we got into the step with dance, and since we sort of got this notion of, let's make this sort of dancing with nature, we said let's continue with this particular theme. And this is where the sort of ballerina, we got this idea of saying, what if we cantilever structure over structure in this particular project, and create a sort of structure which mimics the leap of a ballerina caught mid-flight. So you see the topmost part of the structure, we call it the leap. You see that it's a little blue box that sticks out of the main structure. So it was a bit of engineering here, because we had a sort of gazebo that sort of hangs off the edge of this medium-sized terrace, if I may say. Here again, we continued with the theme of dance, because we sort of got this into what we call a stage with this large terrace. We said, let's sort of cover this terrace with this with covering of sorts, which we call the stage, and that's how we came about with this sort of a concept. So one of the things that this house and this facade in particular had a lot to do was with the way we married these elements of nature with the structure itself, to keep this in a sort of endless sort of movement. So it was in a sort of infinite sort of loop. So if you look at the structure, it seems to be constantly reaching out. Before this project was is completed now, but this was the video of how it was looked when it all came together. And you see the stage with these arms, which are sort of tree-like, again sourced from nature. In reality, this project sort of has turned out like this. It's a year old now, if I'm not mistaken. But what we had is this sort of terrace, and this here is where you see this sort of stage, the setting of this stage in many ways, and you see how this plays out in terms of the facade itself. These are pictures from the site, and of course the Indian touch to Ward of Evil. You see that on the left corner of the building. But here you go. This is in many ways what we wanted in terms of design, in terms of the facade, and how we wish to tell that story. Apart from the real functional and scientific approach we had to actually creating these sort of spaces and voids. You see the floor plans, how they panned out. There's water, there's greenery, there's the actual floor of the outdoor indoor sort of area here. and and how you enter from the main door into this house. So here you get a feel of how it looks at night. We were quite lucky, I think, when we took this shot because the sky was actually like it is as it's seen, and it has in a lot of ways captured the imagination of many. And while it's one of the smaller sort of projects in terms of scale, in terms of a home and what we could bring to this home, it's about this sort of the story that it sort of tells is what I wanted to bring out in terms of a message. I've kept this short and deliberately so. So if there are any questions, but in closing, what I'd like to say, and importantly so, for me, is that creating an aspiration must be a result of any design. It invariably, I think, in many ways, and more so now, I feel is crucial in seeing the entire growth of a nation, or the economy sort of moving ahead, because the marketplace is so strongly contested now in terms of everybody almost operating at the margin, because information is almost equal. There are so many options and so many combinations of what you could do, that in not just design but in any field, setting yourself apart in many ways, making yourself aspirational in many ways, could really drive this sort of economy. And I think facades and the story of these facades in many ways is the first step in telling that story. It's the first impression that one gets of the story. And I think in many of the buildings that you saw in the first two presentations, that is where it set the tone, or it set the impact for what for much of the interiors and much of the spaces.
All right, this was absolutely wonderful, and thank you very much for doing this. And I'm sure everybody who's joined in has had an amazing time listening to you, and of course, seeing the kind of projects and works that you've done. So, thank you. Of course, every year, almost every year, we meet in person. This is the first time we're meeting virtually because of the situation. So, we do miss the process of meeting in person and enjoying that. But nevertheless, these are the times, can't do anything. However, we have a question for you. If you allow me, I can ask that. Sure. So it says the transitional spaces you design are great and very well seen in your projects. How do you manage the integration of services in such impermeable surfaces?
That's an interesting question, right? And services, for instance, is many a time you're working with a bunch of consultants here in India, and you have, for example, a cantilever of let's say just 3 meters or 4 meters, and there are complaints. You have curved, let's say, facades, or you have curved walls and things like that. There are questions on how utilities are taken. But again, coming back to the point, it's all possible. It's all possible, provided you focus on seeing it through. I mean, in terms of saying that this can be done, you rather sit down and see how it can be done rather than how it cannot be done. So for us, I mean, the transitional spaces, I think the question is from so many of our other projects, in the way that it transforms itself also during the day and during the different seasons in the year. Um, but we managed to get this through. Just like, I mean, much of Smaran, Siddharth, and the work that Cadence and Lotus are doing, I mean, you see there's a lot of complication with the way they bring the story together. And of course, yeah, the backbone of having the function of utilities working is crucial. So yes, I mean, it is done, it is being done. And I think for us in India and the Indian designers, there's so much that we do have to show the world. But I mean, like I say always, it takes two, client as well. And yeah, I'm surely, quite certain we're getting there with everything that we're seeing now.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. All right, so thank you very much for your presence virtually, and thank you for doing this for us. And please take care. We shall see you very, very soon.
Thank you all. Thanks.